Have you ever heard the name of King George III? As King of Great Britain during the American Revolution, George III has become for many Americans a byword for the tyranny and arrogance of ancient European aristocracy. The popular musical Hamilton, for example, depicts the king as arrogant. Meanwhile, others emphasize the mental illness he suffered from later in life, which was thrust into the public consciousness in films such as The Madness of King George. His current life and reputation in England, however, paints a much more complicated picture. His reign of 59 years was the longest reign in British history up to that time and was only surpassed by the reigns of his granddaughter, Victoria, and the current monarch, Elizabeth II. The legacy of his reign, during which he presided over some of the most important events in world history, and George's home life during that time, remains a controversial but fascinating subject for historians to this day. Born George William Frederick on June 4, 1738, Prince George's childhood began during a time of intense transition for both Great Britain and his own family. This dynasty, the House of Hanover, ascended the English throne following the death of the childless Queen and Stuart in 1714. All of Anne's closest relatives, such as her half-brother James Francis Edward Stuart, were Roman Catholics, and only a few people in England were mostly Protestants, capable of accepting thoughts about other Catholic kings. Therefore, Parliament appointed her second cousin George, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, commonly known as Hanover, as heir, and he ascended the throne as George I. As men of German descent, George I and his son George II tried hard to win over the British people by patronizing the arts and sciences. They also entrusted the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom to Parliament and the civil government, but none of them were able to overcome the public's suspicion of them. Seeing this, George II's son, Frederick William, Prince of Wales, ensured that his eldest child, George William Frederick, was born and raised in England, educated primarily in English, although he also studied German and French, and raised in England. Anglican Church, not Lutheran. As George III told Parliament in his speech early in his reign, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of England." A shy child, partly due to his sheltered upbringing, George remained close to his parents, especially his mother, and was devastated when his father died in 1751, leaving George to inherit the title of Prince of Wales and the position of heir apparent, clear to the English throne. 9 years later, King George II also died, leaving a new heir who ascended the throne as King George III at the age of 22. To produce his own heir, he married Princess Charlotte of the small German Duchy of Germany, Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The Gold State Carriage commissioned for the coronation and wedding, although not completed in time for either event, is actually still in use today and is worth over £1 million today. He also bought a property for his new wife in London called Buckingham House for her private residence. Queen Victoria later used it as her official London residence, and Buckingham Palace has remained the residence of every British monarch since. The couple remained faithful to each other for the rest of their lives, and would have a total of 15 children together: George in 62, Frederick in 63, William in 65, Charlotte in 66, Edward in 67, Augusta Sophia in 68, Elizabeth in 70, Ernest Augustus in 71, Augustus Frederick in 73, Adolphus in 74, Mary in 76, Sophia in 77, Octavius in 79, Alfred in 80, and Amelia in 83. But marital bliss could only stabilize a turbulent home life. Beyond the pomp and circumstance at Westminster Abbey, where George received his crown on September 22, 1761, Great Britain itself was also in a state of turmoil, caught up in the 7 Years' War that ravaged Europe, North America, and South Asia. Following the successful invasion of Canada, the capture of many French-held islands in the Caribbean, and the victory at Plassey that marked the beginning of British domination of India, the Whig-dominated government enjoyed overwhelming popular support. However, George, fearing the burden of current and future expenses this might impose on society, advocated peace with those opposing France, which put him at odds with a much more warlike minister, William Pitt the Elder, who advocated a preemptive attack on the country. Neutral ones based in Spain. Based on intelligence reports about secret talks between them and France. To counter Pitt's influence, George appointed his friend and mentor the Earl of Bute, a member of the pro-aristocracy Tory party, to the cabinet, forcing out Pitt as well as the Prime Minister the Duke of Newcastle. However, before George and Bute could negotiate a peace treaty, Pitt's predictions ultimately proved accurate, as Spain entered the war as an ally of France, forcing England to expend more resources and manpower to quell the threat. The following year, George and Bute successfully negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And although together they secured significant territorial concessions from Spain and France, such as Canada and Florida, the peace proved so unpopular among the still warlike peoples that forced Bute to negotiate. Resigned soon after, when he and his government faced strong popular reactions at home, many of George's policies sparked rebellions that became the next major conflict during his reign. In 1763, George issued a royal proclamation prohibiting any European settlement in British territory west of the Appalachian Mountains in North America, partly as a concession to allied Native American groups such as the Iroquois Confederacy who fought alongside the British against the French. Many American colonists who hoped to settle in the newly won territory protested, but King George had more hopes for them. George also looked to North America to pay off the enormous war debt the empire had incurred. He shared this opinion with most of the British population, who felt that since the war had begun in North America, the British citizens living there should play a major role in financing the war. In 1765, the King's newest Prime Minister, Lord George Grenville, introduced the Stamp Act, which sparked a wave of protest across all 13 colonies. The strength and intensity of the protests shocked the King and Parliament, forcing a repeal and causing a long period of political instability, with many serving as Prime Minister until electing Lord Frederick North, who succeeded in stabilizing the situation in 1770. Although the King and Parliament had successfully persuaded the repeal of the Stamp Act, King George and Lord North stubbornly maintained belief in their right to tax the colonies. As patriots and loyalists continued to escalate the confrontation between the two factions. Open conflict erupted in Lexington and Concord in April 1775. In New York City, angry colonists tore down the golden statue of King that had ironically been erected in his honor due to the repeal of the act. Stamp Act. Even the Declaration of Independence contained no less than 27 complaints addressed directly to the King, showing how much he had become a symbol of tyranny for the colonists. Ironically, during the Revolutionary War, the King did not play much of a direct role in the war effort, but he still invested. He urged his military and civilian governments to remain steadfast in their efforts to quell the rebellion, and not to compromise the rebels' goal of independence. He entrusted Lord North, with whom he frequently corresponded, to keep him up to date on the state of the army and other news from the colony. He may have been particularly influential in recruiting mercenaries collectively called the Hessians from 6 small German kingdoms, especially as several of these princes were his relatives. He was also almost directly affected when Continental Army Commander George Washington planned to kidnap his son. The teenage Prince William Henry, the future King William IV, visited New York in the fall of 1781 while serving as a midshipman in the Royal Navy, where he also served as court for a time. Learning of this, Washington agreed to a plan proposed by Colonel Matthias Ogden to send a group of men led by the colonel and smuggle them into town where they could break into the prince's residence, force him out at gunpoint if necessary, and bring him back secretly into Continental-held territory while evading hundreds of British and Hessian soldiers patrolling the streets. Washington then abandoned the plan in March 1782 when he learned that British intelligence was aware of the plan and doubled the prince's guard. King George was ultimately devastated to learn that he had finally lost the war against America, and wrote on an inaccurate date, America is defeated. Should we take that hit? Although some historians have accused the king of intransigence in the face of American causes, he had reasonable grounds to worry about the cohesion of the British Empire, on which almost all of Britain's prosperity depended. However, after accepting the shame of the defeat, he immediately turned his thoughts to a plan to mitigate the damage. In the same letter as before, he also argued that, apart from tobacco exports, British control of the 13 colonies was ultimately a financial loss, writing, "It is to be hoped that we shall gain more profit from their trade as friends than we can obtain from them as colonies, and that Britain could maintain its much more profitable holdings in the Caribbean and India as long as it maintained a formidable navy." When he met American diplomat and founding father John Adams in 1785, 2 years after the war ended, he reportedly told him, "I was the last man to agree to secession, but this separation having occurred and being inevitable, I have always said, as I have said, that I would be the first to welcome the friendship of the United States as an independent power." Although he resigned in defeat, the loss of the colony caused a period of political instability in England that required immediate attention. The government that negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783 rested on a tenuous alliance between the king's friend, Lord North, and a deeply radical Whig named Charles James Fox, whom the king hated and openly supported the American cause. This alliance soon collapsed after ratification, leaving the king to search for someone who could sail the ship of state well. On December 19, 1783, he finally chose the namesake son of his old rival William Pitt, often referred to as William Pitt the Younger. The king's choice was then confirmed by a subsequent general election, which gave the king a brief period of popularity, and Pitt himself went on to dominate English politics for the next 2 decades, but this period of respite ended with King George's first major battle, an illness that later forced him to step down from power. Given the limited medical knowledge of the 18th century, we cannot be certain exactly what ailment befell the king, but modern diagnoses suggest a number of possible causes: bipolar disorder, for example, or possibly a genetic blood disease called porphyria that caused the illness. Attacks the nervous system. George himself often stated that this was caused by government pressure and turmoil in his home life, both of which he often experienced. Regardless of the cause, the first major attack occurred in 1788, several years after his 2 youngest sons died as infants. Beginning in the summer of that year and lasting until February 1789, the king was completely helpless, prone to manic episodes and strange emotional outbursts. During his convalescence, Charles Fox successfully pressured Prime Minister Pitt to pass a bill in the House of Commons to force the king to retire and install his eldest son, George, as regent, but the House of Lords delayed the bill long enough for the king to retire. To recover. But this is not the end of the district's problems. As soon as the king recovered his mind, all of Europe exploded with the start of the French Revolution in 1789, and all the years of political upheaval and military conflict that accompanied it. Despite the Kingdom of France's long-standing status as England's long-standing rival, the revolution that overthrew the Bourbon dynasty posed more of a real threat to the established social order in Europe than it ever had in America. And after the execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, England quickly stepped into a coalition to suppress the nascent republic and restore the Bourbons. But to everyone's surprise, the French Republic proved extremely formidable on the battlefield. Despite the chaos that rocked Paris during the Reign of Terror. At the end of the War of the First Coalition in 1797, only Great Britain remained standing among the coalition partners, as King George and William Pitt proved to be equally strong opponents. The subsequent War of the Second Coalition, which saw Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power and the failure of the French invasion of England, produced similar results, thanks in large part to British naval superiority. Of course, it was the Prime Minister who directed much of British military policy during the conflict, but in the public consciousness, the king remained a symbol of resistance to French militancy, as immortalized in James Gilray's many cartoons. where he often appeared as a humorous, but still alone a friendly figure, puts an evil figure like Napoleon in his place. During this time, Parliament also passed the Act of Union of 1800, which united the king's traditionally autonomous territories of Great Britain and Ireland under one nation, forming the United Kingdom, and among other things, created the modern British Union flag. But despite all appearances of unity, an issue related to the French Wars and unification caused a fatal rift between the king and his old partner Pitt the Younger. As the conflict progressed, Pitt became concerned with certain appeals to the Irish people, who were largely disenfranchised because of their Catholicism and who also made up 1/3 of the soldiers in the British Army. To prevent a potentially disastrous uprising, Pitt introduced a bill in Parliament aimed at ending all official discrimination against Catholics in civil life, but the king, upon learning of the bill, did not approve it. In his eyes, Catholic emancipation, as it was called, was a direct violation of his coronation oath to uphold the Protestant religion as well as his position as head of the Church of England. Without his royal assent, Pitt's bill failed and his decades-long tenure as Prime Minister ended. It was King George's last active political decision. After initial weakness in 1788, King George continued to fight the disease until 1810, when it returned with a vengeance. Historians blame the trigger for this latest event of madness on the death of the king's beloved youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, that same year at the age of 27. Realizing the king's inability to carry out his official duties, Parliament quickly passed the bill. The Regency Act of 1811 authorized his eldest son George, Prince of Wales, to assume the duties of the crown for the next 9 years as Prince Regent. During this period, England experienced several important advances in economics, politics, and the arts and sciences. The War of 1812 began and ended in this period, making George III King of Great Britain during both of its major conflicts with the United States. Napoleon's threat also ended at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, making the victorious Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, an international icon. Regency England, as it is called, is a byword for its elegance and excess, befitting Prince George's own personality. But the king was barely conscious enough to notice any of it. Although his kingdom prospered economically and enjoyed military glory, the king lived a secluded life at Windsor Castle. Blind, deaf, and in constant pain, George was barely aware of anything around him, including the death of Queen Charlotte in 1818. A contemporary engraving by the portrait painter Henry Meyer depicts him with tousled hair and a long beard, a lasting testament to his madness. His struggle only ended when he died on January 29, 1820, ending his tenure when his son ascended the throne as George IV. His body was interred in St. Mary's Chapel. George at Windsor Castle, the loss of America and the madness that ended his life have permanently changed the perception of King George III in popular memory, but none of this tells the full story of his life. As a statesman, King George was well liked by the public, including in America, even though they mocked his eccentricities, and was respected by most of Parliament. As patron, he enthusiastically supported technological advances during the first few years of the Industrial Revolution. And as king, he made himself an effective figure of national resistance against the threat of Napoleon Bonaparte. Most importantly, George's governing style, which favored background stability and trusted Parliament to decide most policy, set an important precedent for his successors.